There are nights that quietly disappear into memory, and then there are nights that seem ordinary at first but leave behind a story no one ever forgets. Imagine a peaceful home where the day has finally come to an end. The dinner table has been cleared, warm cups of tea are being passed around, and the family gathers together with no special plans other than enjoying each other's company. Laughter fills the room as old memories are shared, childhood stories are retold, and everyone seems completely relaxed. Then, almost without thinking, someone asks a simple question: what kind of person do you hope to spend your life with someday? The laughter slowly fades. It's not because the question is difficult, but because it's the kind of question that makes everyone stop and reflect. One by one, family members share what matters most to them. Not wealth, not appearance, not perfection, but qualities like kindness, honesty, patience, and the ability to stand by someone through life's challenges. Finally, one person speaks more quietly than the others. "I don't know who that person will be," they say, "and I don't know when our paths will cross. But I hope that wherever they are, they're becoming someone who values trust, compassion, and genuine love." The room falls silent. Not because anyone has discovered a secret, but because everyone recognizes how deeply human that hope is. Outside, the night grows darker, and the stars begin to fill the sky. Inside the house, the conversation continues, shifting from dreams about the future to lessons learned from the past. A grandmother smiles as she remembers how unexpected her own love story was. A grandfather quietly explains that the strongest relationships aren't built in a single magical moment. They're built through thousands of ordinary choices, listening when it's easier to argue, forgiving when it's easier to hold a grudge, and showing up for each other every single day. The younger members of the family listen carefully, realizing that meaningful love isn't about finding a perfect person. It's about two imperfect people choosing to grow together with honesty and respect. That realization changes the mood of the evening. The conversation becomes less about searching for the one and more about becoming the kind of person who can build a healthy, lasting relationship when the opportunity finally arrives. The conversation didn't end there. In fact, it seemed as though that one simple question had opened a door that had remained closed for years. The room, which only moments ago had been filled with casual laughter and playful teasing, now carried a different kind of warmth. A quiet sincerity that invited everyone to speak from the heart. The youngest member of the family looked around the table, noticing something unusual. No one was trying to impress anyone. No one was searching for the perfect answer. Instead, each person was sharing a piece of their own journey, as though they suddenly remembered that the most valuable lessons in life are rarely found in books or grand speeches, but in the ordinary moments we spend with the people who know us best. Outside, the wind gently rustled the trees, and the soft glow of the porch light cast long shadows across the garden. It felt as though time itself had slowed down, giving everyone permission to reflect on the lives they had lived and the futures they still hoped to create. The grandmother was the first to break the silence again. She leaned back in her chair, wrapped her hands around her warm cup of tea, and smiled in the quiet way that only comes from years of experience. "When I was young," she began, "I thought love was something you found. I believed that one day a person would simply appear, and everything would suddenly make sense. But life has a way of teaching us that real love isn't discovered all at once. It's built slowly, one conversation, one sacrifice, one act of kindness at a time." Everyone listened carefully, not because her words were dramatic, but because they carried the weight of someone who had lived through both happiness and heartbreak. She spoke about the difficult seasons of marriage, about misunderstandings that could have ended everything, and about the countless moments when choosing patience mattered more than being right. Her voice never became louder, yet every sentence seemed to settle gently into the hearts of everyone around the table. The grandfather nodded in agreement before adding his own perspective. He explained that people often spend years searching for extraordinary signs, believing that love must always arrive with overwhelming emotion or impossible coincidences. Yet, in his experience, the strongest relationships often began in the simplest ways. Sometimes it was a shared laugh during an ordinary afternoon. Sometimes it was a conversation that lasted longer than expected. Sometimes it was realizing that the person beside you made difficult days feel lighter, not because they solved every problem, but because they reminded you that you didn't have to face those problems alone. Life, he said quietly, has a strange way of bringing people together, but what keeps them together isn't destiny alone. It's the choices they continue making long after the excitement of the first meeting has faded. Those words lingered in the air. No one rushed to respond. Instead, everyone seemed lost in their own memories. The parents exchanged a brief smile, silently remembering the early days of their own relationship. They remembered the uncertainty, the mistakes, the moments when giving up would have been easier than trying again. Looking back now, they realized that none of the memories they treasured most involved expensive gifts or grand romantic gestures. What remained unforgettable were the ordinary moments, late-night conversations after exhausting days, encouraging each other through unexpected failures, celebrating small victories, and standing together when life became unpredictable. It was in those ordinary moments that trust had quietly taken root, growing stronger with every passing year. The youngest person at the table listened to every story with growing curiosity. Until that evening, they had imagined that meaningful relationships began with certainty, as though two people simply recognized each other instantly and never questioned anything again. But the stories unfolding around them painted a very different picture. They revealed that every lasting relationship carried moments of doubt, seasons of waiting, and opportunities to choose compassion over pride. For the first time, the idea of love felt less like a fairy tale and more like a journey. One that required courage, honesty, and the willingness to keep learning. As the evening drew closer to midnight, the conversation slowly drifted toward the future. No one claimed to know what tomorrow would bring. No one pretended that life followed a perfect plan. Yet there was a quiet sense of hope in the room, a shared belief that even though the future remained uncertain, it also remained full of possibility. The young listener quietly looked out the nearby window. The stars stretched endlessly across the sky, each one shining from an unimaginable distance, reminding them how vast the world truly was. Somewhere beyond that horizon were millions of people living lives completely unknown to them, people with their own dreams, struggles, fears, and hopes. The thought was strangely comforting. It reminded them that every meaningful connection begins with two strangers, each carrying a lifetime of experiences that eventually become part of a shared story. For the rest of the night, no one spoke very much. The family simply enjoyed each other's presence, allowing the silence to say what words no longer could. It was the kind of silence that felt peaceful rather than empty, the kind that leaves a lasting impression long after the evening has ended. And although no one at that table knew what the future held, they all carried the same quiet understanding as they prepared to leave the room. Every meaningful relationship begins long before two people ever meet. It begins in the choices they make, the values they build, and the person they become while life is still preparing them for whatever comes next. The clock on the wall quietly moved past midnight. One by one, the family members stood up from the table, collecting empty cups and folding blankets that had been draped across the chairs. The conversations had become softer now, almost like whispers carried by the stillness of the night. Yet something about this evening felt different from every other family gathering they had shared before. It wasn't because anything extraordinary had happened. No impossible event had taken place. No one had revealed a life-changing secret. And yet, every person in that room sensed that they were walking away with something far more valuable than an exciting story. They were leaving with a deeper understanding of what it truly means to hope, to wait, and to prepare for a meaningful relationship without knowing when or how it might arrive. As everyone wished each other good night, the youngest member of the family remained seated for a few extra moments. Their eyes wandered across the room, taking in every familiar detail: the family photographs hanging on the wall, the old clock that had marked countless evenings like this one, the bookshelf filled with novels collected over decades, and the warm glow of a single lamp that now illuminated the otherwise quiet house. It was amazing how ordinary everything looked, and yet how extraordinary it suddenly felt. They realized that perhaps the biggest moments in life don't always announce themselves with dramatic music or unforgettable speeches. Sometimes, they arrive disguised as ordinary conversations that quietly change the way we see ourselves and the people around us. Later that night, unable to sleep, they stepped outside onto the front porch. The air was cool, carrying the gentle scent of rain-soaked earth from an earlier shower. The neighborhood was almost completely silent. Only the distant sound of wind moving through the trees interrupted the stillness. Looking up, they saw a sky filled with countless stars, each one shining from a distance so great that it was impossible to truly comprehend. It made them wonder how many other people, in different cities and different countries, might also be standing beneath the same sky at that exact moment, asking themselves similar questions about love, purpose, and the future. The thought didn't make them feel lonely. Instead, it reminded them that every human being carries hopes that are often invisible to everyone else. They remembered something their grandmother had said only an hour earlier: life has a strange way of preparing us for tomorrow through the lessons we learn today. At the time, it had sounded like simple advice. But now, standing beneath the stars, those words seemed to carry a deeper meaning. Perhaps every disappointment had taught them resilience. Perhaps every goodbye had shown them the importance of appreciating those who truly cared. Perhaps every delay had been an opportunity to become wiser, kinder, and more patient than they had been before. Growth, they realized, rarely happens all at once. It happens quietly, through hundreds of small choices that often go unnoticed until one day we look back and realize how much we have changed. Inside the house, the lights slowly began to turn off one by one. The parents made sure every door was locked before heading upstairs. The grandparents exchanged one last smile before wishing each other good night. The family dog curled up in its favorite corner, completely unaware of the thoughtful conversations that had filled the evening. Everything returned to its usual rhythm. Yet for one person, sleep refused to come easily. Their mind kept replaying every story they had heard, every lesson that had been shared, every gentle reminder that meaningful relationships are not built on perfection, but on honesty, patience, and mutual respect. They walked back into the living room and paused in front of an old family photograph resting on a wooden shelf. It showed their grandparents many years ago, standing together on a bright summer afternoon. Both of them looked impossibly young, smiling at a future they could never have predicted. Looking at that photograph, it became clear that no picture ever captures the difficult chapters that come afterward. It doesn't show the sacrifices, the misunderstandings, the tears, or the moments when walking away might have seemed easier than staying. Yet somehow, through all of those unseen chapters, they had continued choosing each other. That realization made the photograph even more beautiful than before. For the first time in a long while, they stopped worrying about finding someone immediately. Instead, they began wondering how they could become a better friend, a better listener, and a kinder person today. They understood that every healthy relationship begins long before two people meet. It begins with the way we treat others, the promises we keep, the compassion we show, and the integrity we practice when no one is watching. If love was ever going to become part of their future, they wanted to be ready, not by becoming perfect, but by becoming genuine. A gentle breeze drifted through the open window, causing the curtains to sway softly in the moonlight. The house was now completely quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the night before fading back into silence. It was the kind of peaceful moment that often passes unnoticed, yet somehow remains in our memory for years. Standing there, they realized that life rarely gives us certainty about tomorrow. What it gives us instead is the opportunity to choose who we become today. And perhaps that choice, repeated again and again over time, shapes the future more than any prediction ever could. With that thought in mind, they finally smiled, turned off the last lamp in the living room, and slowly made their way upstairs. The house fell silent once again. Outside, the stars continued shining above the sleeping world, unchanged and patient, quietly reminding anyone willing to look up that every new day carries possibilities we cannot yet see. And although the future remained unwritten, one thing felt certain in that quiet moment. Every meaningful story begins long before its most unforgettable chapter is ever told. Morning arrived slowly, as if the world itself was reluctant to interrupt the peace that had settled over the house the night before. Long before the sun climbed above the horizon, the first rays of light slipped gently through the curtains, painting soft golden lines across the wooden floor. Birds began singing outside, and the cool breeze carried the scent of wet grass through the slightly open window. It was the kind of morning that looked ordinary to anyone passing by, yet for those inside the house, something had quietly changed. No one spoke about it. There was no dramatic announcement, no emotional confession waiting to happen. It was simply a feeling, subtle, calm, and impossible to ignore. The conversation from the previous evening had left every member of the family thinking about their own journey, their own choices, and the kind of life they hoped to build in the years ahead. The kitchen slowly came to life. The familiar sound of a kettle beginning to boil echoed through the room, followed by the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and toasted bread. The grandmother was already awake, preparing breakfast the same way she had for years, humming an old melody that no one else in the family seemed to remember. The grandfather unfolded the morning newspaper, adjusting his glasses before quietly reading the headlines. The parents entered the room a few minutes later, exchanging sleepy smiles as they greeted everyone with a simple, "Good morning." It felt like any other day, and yet every glance, every smile, and every quiet pause carried a little more meaning than before. The youngest member of the family walked into the kitchen more slowly than usual. Their thoughts were still occupied by everything they had heard the night before. They took a seat near the window, watching the sunlight dance across the garden as tiny drops of water shimmered on the leaves. For the first time in a long while, they weren't thinking about finding the perfect relationship. Instead, they found themselves wondering what kind of person they wanted to become over the next few years. It was a different question, and somehow it felt more important than the one they had been asking themselves for so long. As breakfast continued, the grandfather folded his newspaper and looked around the table. "You know," he said with a gentle smile, "people spend so much of their lives waiting for the future that they forget to notice the life they're already living." Everyone looked toward him, knowing another story was about to begin. "When I was your age," he continued, "I believed happiness would arrive after I achieved something big. After I found success, after I earned enough money, after everything finally went according to plan. But life taught me something completely different. The happiest memories I have today weren't planned at all. They were ordinary mornings like this one. Shared meals. Long conversations. Quiet walks. Moments I almost overlooked because I thought something greater was waiting just around the corner. The room became silent once again. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that naturally follows words worth remembering. The youngest member of the family slowly looked around the table. The people sitting there had experienced different lives, different struggles, different dreams, and yet they all seemed to agree on one thing: the most meaningful parts of life rarely announce themselves while they're happening. We recognize their importance only after they've become memories. After breakfast, everyone gradually returned to their routines. The parents prepared for work. The grandparents stepped outside to water the flowers in the garden. The younger siblings gathered their books before leaving for school. The house, which had felt so full only moments before, slowly became quiet again. Yet the youngest member of the family remained by the window, watching the morning unfold beyond the glass. Children laughed as they rode their bicycles down the street. Neighbors greeted one another with friendly waves. A mail carrier carefully placed letters into nearby mailboxes before continuing along the road. Life moved forward exactly as it always had, reminding them that every person they passed each day was carrying a story completely invisible to everyone else. That thought stayed with them for hours. They realized how easy it is to imagine that everyone else has everything figured out. We see people smiling in photographs, celebrating achievements, and sharing joyful moments, but we rarely witness the quiet battles they fight behind closed doors. Perhaps the stranger walking past your house has spent years rebuilding their confidence after heartbreak. Perhaps the person laughing with friends is carrying worries they never speak about. Perhaps someone sitting alone in a cafe is gathering the courage to begin again after a chapter of life they never expected to end. Every person, they realized, is living a story that cannot be understood by appearances alone. As the afternoon sun climbed higher into the sky, they decided to take a walk through the nearby park. It had always been one of their favorite places, not because anything extraordinary happened there, but because it offered something increasingly rare in the modern world: space to think. The trees stood tall and steady, their branches swaying gently with the breeze. Families spread blankets across the grass, children chased one another through open fields, elderly couples strolled hand in hand along winding paths, and joggers passed by with determined expressions. Watching all of them, it became impossible not to notice how differently every person experienced the same world. Some were beginning new chapters. Others were closing old ones. Some walked with confidence, while others were still searching for direction. Yet all of them shared the same hope: that tomorrow might hold something worth looking forward to. Sitting on an old wooden bench beneath the shade of a large oak tree, they closed their eyes for a moment and simply listened. The rustling leaves, distant laughter, birdsong, and gentle wind blended together into a peaceful rhythm. It reminded them that life isn't always asking us to move faster. Sometimes it asks us to slow down enough to appreciate where we already are. Perhaps that was the lesson hidden inside the conversation from the previous night. Not that the future was guaranteed, but that the present deserved just as much attention as the dreams we carried about tomorrow. With a deep breath, they opened their eyes and smiled quietly to themselves. For the first time in many months, they weren't afraid of not knowing what came next. The future no longer felt like an empty space waiting to be filled. Instead, it felt like an unwritten story. One that would be shaped not by certainty, but by the choices, kindness, and courage they practiced each day from this moment forward. The afternoon passed with an unhurried rhythm, the kind of peaceful pace that often goes unnoticed until years later, when it becomes one of those memories people wish they could relive just one more time. Sitting beneath the shade of the old oak tree, they watched the park slowly transform as the hours drifted by. Children who had been running across the grass were now sitting beside their parents, eating ice cream while laughing over stories that seemed important only to them. A young artist quietly painted the landscape from a nearby bench, carefully adding every color to the canvas as though trying to capture not just the beauty of the place, but the feeling it carried. An elderly man walked slowly along the path with his loyal dog, smiling at strangers who smiled back without saying a word. Everything around them seemed to carry the same gentle reminder: life is happening now, in the ordinary moments we often overlook while waiting for extraordinary ones. As they continued watching the world around them, a thought quietly entered their mind. How many opportunities had they missed simply because they were too focused on what hadn't happened yet? How many beautiful conversations had they rushed through because their attention was fixed on an uncertain future? How many sunsets had they ignored while worrying about tomorrow? It wasn't an easy realization to accept, but it was an honest one. For years, they had measured their life by milestones that hadn't yet arrived, forgetting that every meaningful journey is built from ordinary days like this one. No grand celebration, no dramatic turning point, just a quiet afternoon in a park where the world continued moving exactly as it always had. Their thoughts were interrupted by the sound of gentle laughter nearby. Turning slightly, they noticed an elderly couple sitting on another bench a short distance away. The two of them weren't speaking very much. Instead, they simply shared the same space, occasionally smiling at one another, pointing toward the flowers blooming nearby, or quietly watching the birds hop across the grass. There was something remarkably comforting about their silence. It wasn't empty. It wasn't awkward. It was the silence of two people who had spent enough years together that words were no longer necessary to understand one another. Watching them, it became clear that companionship wasn't always about exciting adventures or constant conversation. Sometimes, the greatest gift another person can offer is simply their peaceful presence. That simple observation lingered in their heart as they stood up and continued walking through the winding paths of the park. Every step seemed lighter than the one before. The pressure they had placed on themselves for so many years. To have every answer, to know exactly where life was leading, to compare their timeline with everyone else's, began to fade little by little. Instead of asking when the next important chapter would begin, they found themselves appreciating the chapter they were already living. It wasn't perfect. There were still unanswered questions, unfinished dreams, and moments of uncertainty waiting ahead. But perhaps perfection had never been the goal. Perhaps the goal was simply to keep growing, one honest step at a time. As evening slowly approached, the sunlight softened into warm shades of gold and amber. Long shadows stretched across the walking paths, and the cool breeze carried the gentle fragrance of blooming flowers throughout the park. Families began packing their belongings before heading home. Cyclists rode past with cheerful smiles. Friends said goodbye after spending the afternoon together, promising to meet again soon. Watching all of this, they realized that every goodbye also carries the possibility of another hello. Every ending quietly makes room for a new beginning, even when we cannot yet see it. They eventually found themselves standing near a small lake tucked away in the center of the park. The surface of the water was perfectly still, reflecting the colorful evening sky with astonishing clarity. Looking into that reflection, they were reminded of something their grandfather had once said years ago: the clearest reflections appear when the water is calm. At the time, they had thought he was only speaking about nature. Now they understood he had been talking about life itself. When our minds are constantly filled with fear, comparison, and endless questions, everything becomes distorted. But when we allow ourselves moments of stillness, the answers we truly need often become easier to recognize. They sat beside the lake until the first stars began appearing overhead. One by one, tiny lights emerged across the sky, quietly replacing the fading colors of sunset. There was something deeply reassuring about that simple transition. The day had come to an end exactly as countless days before it had. The sun had disappeared beyond the horizon, yet no one doubted it would rise again tomorrow. Perhaps hope worked the same way. Even when it seemed hidden behind difficult seasons, it never truly disappeared. It simply waited patiently for the right moment to shine again. As they finally began the walk home, the streets were filled with the comforting sounds of ordinary life. Neighbors greeted each other from front porches. The aroma of freshly prepared dinners drifted from nearby houses. Streetlights flickered on one after another, gently illuminating sidewalks that only hours earlier had been bright with sunshine. Every home they passed held its own untold story. Some families were celebrating happy news. Others were quietly supporting one another through difficult times. Some were beginning new chapters, while others were finding the strength to close old ones. It became impossible not to feel connected to all of them in some small way. Different stories, different journeys, but the same human hope for love, understanding, and a future filled with meaning. When they finally reached home, they paused for a moment before opening the front door. Looking up at the night sky one last time, they smiled quietly. Nothing extraordinary had happened that day. No miracle had appeared. No mysterious message had arrived. Yet somehow, everything felt different. Not because the world had changed, but because they had begun seeing it through different eyes. And sometimes, that is where the most important transformations begin, not in the events around us, but in the perspective we carry within us as we continue moving forward into whatever tomorrow may bring. The front door opened with the familiar sound it had made for as long as they could remember. The warmth of home greeted them immediately, carrying with it the comforting aroma of dinner that still lingered in the air. Somewhere in the kitchen, dishes were being washed. A quiet melody drifted from an old radio resting on the countertop. Upstairs, someone laughed while watching a movie, and from another room came the gentle ticking of the same old clock that had marked the passing of countless ordinary evenings. Everything looked exactly as it always had, yet after spending the day reflecting on the conversations from the previous night, even the smallest details seemed to hold a meaning they had never noticed before. It was almost as if life itself had slowed down just enough to allow them to appreciate the beauty hidden inside familiar moments. After helping clear the dinner table, they quietly excused themselves and walked toward the small study at the end of the hallway. It had always been their favorite room in the house. Unlike the rest of the home, where conversations and laughter constantly filled the air, this room remained peaceful at almost every hour of the day. Wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each one filled with books collected over decades. Some had faded covers, their pages worn from being read many times. Others looked almost untouched, patiently waiting for someone to discover the stories hidden inside them. A single desk stood beside the window, illuminated by the soft glow of an antique lamp that had belonged to their grandfather long before they were born. They gently pulled open one of the desk drawers, searching for a notebook where they could write down the thoughts that had been quietly growing inside them since the previous evening. As they moved aside old papers and forgotten letters, something unexpected caught their attention. Hidden beneath a stack of photographs was a small leather-bound journal. The cover had become worn with age, its edges softened by years of careful handling. Curious, they lifted it from the drawer and brushed away a thin layer of dust. There was no title on the cover. No name. Only a small date embossed in fading gold letters from many years ago. For a moment they hesitated. It felt personal. Almost sacred. They wondered whether it belonged to their grandfather or perhaps even someone older. Turning it over in their hands, they noticed a small handwritten note tucked between the first few pages. It simply read: "Some stories are written not to be hidden forever, but to be understood when the time is right." Those words lingered in the silence of the room. Taking a slow breath, they carefully opened the journal. The handwriting inside was elegant but unmistakably old. Every page had been filled with thoughtful reflections rather than dramatic events. There were no grand adventures. No unbelievable mysteries. Instead, there were quiet observations about life, patience, friendship, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways people change over time. The first entry described a young man who believed happiness would only arrive after he achieved everything he had dreamed of. But years later, the writer admitted that the happiest days of his life had been the ones he almost ignored because they seemed too ordinary to matter. They continued reading. Another page spoke about disappointment. "There will be seasons," the writer explained, "when life feels painfully unfair. During those moments, you'll be tempted to believe that the world has forgotten you. Don't rush to that conclusion. Time often reveals reasons that emotion cannot immediately understand." Those words settled deeply within them. How many times had they mistaken delay for failure? How many opportunities had quietly appeared only because something else hadn't worked out first? Turning another page, they discovered an entry describing the importance of kindness. The writer explained that people often remember the way someone made them feel long after they forget the exact words that were spoken. Success fades. Achievements become memories. Even beauty changes with time. But kindness leaves an impression that can quietly influence another person's life for years without either person fully realizing it. The room had grown completely silent now. Outside the window, the evening sky had darkened once again, and tiny lights from neighboring homes flickered gently through the trees. They had intended to write in their own notebook, yet instead they found themselves completely absorbed in the thoughts of someone who had lived decades before them. It was remarkable how advice written so many years ago could still feel deeply relevant today. Different generations. Different experiences. Yet the same questions about purpose, relationships, hope, and the search for a meaningful life. As they reached the middle of the journal, one particular sentence immediately captured their attention. "Never allow loneliness to convince you that you must accept less than the respect you deserve." They stopped reading. That single sentence echoed in their mind again and again. It wasn't written with anger. It wasn't written to encourage fear. It was written with compassion, reminding the reader that waiting with self-respect is far healthier than rushing into connections built on insecurity or the fear of being alone. For several minutes, they simply stared at the page without turning it. The words felt strangely comforting. Not because they promised an easy future, but because they reminded them that every meaningful relationship begins with the relationship we build with ourselves first. Outside, the wind gently moved the branches against the window, creating a soft rhythmic sound that blended with the distant ticking of the hallway clock. Time continued moving forward exactly as it always had. Yet inside that quiet study, surrounded by old books and forgotten memories, something important had begun to change. Not the future. Not destiny. Simply the way they understood the present. They carefully closed the journal, placing it back on the desk instead of returning it to the drawer. They knew they would continue reading it another day. For now, it had already given them enough to think about. Standing by the window, they looked toward the stars appearing one by one above the quiet neighborhood. The world beyond those rooftops remained vast, unpredictable, and filled with countless stories unfolding at the very same moment. They still didn't know exactly where life would lead them. They still couldn't predict who they would meet or what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in a very long while, they no longer felt the need to know every answer. Some journeys, they realized, become more meaningful precisely because they unfold one page at a time. And perhaps their own story had only just begun.